Well, let's have a look at the morning papers, the Sunday papers and news websites. Now joining me are Stuart Hughes from BBC World News and documentary filmmaker Inge Hanson. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Stuart, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, there's plenty of interesting and rather varied stories in the Sundays today, and it's good to see, because after 3 months in which the Sundays have been filled almost cover to cover with coronavirus news, there's a bit more variety today. I think in no small part it's because, as we know as journalists, it's getting a little easier now to get out of the house and do some of the kind of journalism that we always used to do. Not surprisingly, there's a significant amount of coverage on the front pages of those terrible stabbings in Reading. That makes the Express, Telegraph, Times, Mirror, People. That's all on page one, certainly in their later editions. But the first story that caught my attention is the splash in the Observer. School closures will trigger UK child mental health crisis. And the Observer's highlighting something that I think was almost inevitably going to become a story at some point. Experts warning that many school children are going to need support from psychologists because their lives have been turned upside down by school closures and lockdown. The Observer says educational psychologists advising the government are saying that ministers will have to foot a massive bill for professional help, and the longer that schools are shut, the worse the problem's going to be. Perhaps all of that is hardly surprising, and with a depressing inevitability that again is hardly surprising. Psychologists saying the problems are likely to be worse amongst kids from underprivileged families who suffered most. As a professor from Oxford University tells the Observer that she's expecting a tsunami of referrals for mental health treatment. I'm in two minds about this story. It is an important one, and on the one hand, I think it's not just children who are going to be in need of psychological support. There's going to be a lot of groups of people who are going to be in need of professional support when all of this is over. But I do a lot of work in the field of resilience, particularly in journalism, and I know that children can be sometimes far more resilient than we give them credit for. And I think the danger is that we rush to medicalise the behaviour of youngsters who are just simply going to be processing difficult emotions and difficult experiences in the best way they can, and who will come through it. So while I don't doubt for a moment there will be a need for psychological services as we emerge from lockdown, not just for children, we shouldn't necessarily rush to put them on the therapy couch or prescribe medication. We use the phrase watchful waiting in the jargon. Just wait and see, and I think that's also going to be vital so that we don't run the risk of labelling youngsters who are processing what they've been through. We don't label them as psychologically scarred too early.
Inge, what have you seen?
Well, I've started off with an article about two amazing women that actually I've been working with. They're Sam and Shauna, who own the Hangfire restaurant in Barrie. And they have a series going out now called Sam and Shauna's Big Barbecue, which I was working on it, casting. But the reason I wanted to pick this out is that it's just such a great story about how two women decided to live their dream. You know, they left their jobs. They took a big road trip across the United States to meet Dolly Parton. But along the way, they became enamored of American barbecue because it just kind of combined everything that was important to them: music, food, people, and they used that to create a career, which they've been doing amazingly well in. And I just admire them for that. And also, I think what I enjoy about the series is that you meet so many different people across Wales, communities that you wouldn't know about. If you combine that with food, I mean, what's there to lose?
So what is the story about them in Wales Online? Is it just a feature, or is it a news story, or what?
Yeah, it's a news story about them. I mean, I think the focus of the article is that they came out on a TV show that they were doing, the Saturday Kitchen, which they've been on quite a bit, and they were on the program on the day that they were supposed to get married. So the feature is kind of about their personal lives and how, they've shown the spotlight on themselves now, and then through that talks about their background in terms of creating this barbecue restaurant that become so popular in Wales. I mean, sadly, it's closed now, of course, because of the pandemic. But I think what I like about it is that it shows that you can, they have made their dream come true, through a lot of hard graft, etc. And meeting, interesting people along the way. And what I do like about it is that it's such a diversity of communities. And I think, obviously now with everything going on in the States here and, all this discussion of racial strife, et cetera, it's really great to see all the communities together in this show, plus food.
Stuart's next story has misleading headline of the day: 1 metre plus, the new rule that will reopen UK. Well, as we heard from the First Minister earlier, that's devolved, but Sunday Telegraph isn't very good at spotting things that are devolved. Stuart?
Yeah, I've got to say, actually, just picking up on Inge's story, I've got to say the thought of eating American barbecue in Wales, it sounds like my idea of heaven. If they want to put me down for the first table when they reopen, then I'll be happily on the list. But moving back to the Sunday Telegraph, yes, this a new phrase that seems deliberately designed to confuse and could have come out from of an episode of Yes Minister. That phrase, 1 metre plus. And my initial thought, and probably yours too, is 1 metre plus what? An inch? Half a mile? What are we talking about? As we found after the initial phase of lockdown, when you start making your messaging a bit more nuanced, people are either baffled or they just choose to interpret the rules in their own way. But the Sunday Telegraph says that Boris Johnson's poised to announce this new 1 metre plus rule for all venues, presumably in England only initially, at least, in an overhaul designed to unlock swathes of the economy. What does it mean? According to the Telegraph from July the 4th, people, as I say, probably in England only initially, will be able to reduce their social distance to a metre if they take additional measures, such as wearing a mask. Sunday Telegraph saying that Boris Johnson may make an announcement on this on Tuesday. The reasons, pretty obvious. A lot of businesses have been saying for weeks that they'll go bust, especially in the hospitality industry. Maybe our barbecue eating friends will be having this discussion. But there's warnings that they'll go bust if the 2 metre rule remains in place. So, unfortunately, expect to hear the phrase 1 metre plus creeping into general parlance over the next week, but also expect a lot of people to be baffled by what the devil it actually means. To me, it bears all the hallmarks of a classic Whitehall fudge.
Inge, what have you seen?
This, again, it's in Wales Online, and I think that the articles that have really piqued my attention, I think probably have to do with the fact that I'm an American and I've been watching what's been happening in the U.S. in terms of Black Lives Matter and, of course, the horrible death of George Floyd in Chicago. But this one is kind of picking up. It's Wales. It's an article about Wales' history with the slave trade, and an interview with a man named Chris Evans. He's a historian who wrote Slave Wales, the Welsh and Atlantic Slavery. And I really found this interesting because, obviously there's been a lot of controversy now about statues, with, pulling statues down, obviously in Bristol and in the United States, and the concerns about Thomas Picton, who I'd actually never heard of, calls to remove his statue from where it is now. But I thought it was quite interesting because you don't hear a lot. There's some about what if any connection Wales would have with the slave trade. And this article kind of brings up the fact that Wales wasn't rich enough really to be able to engage in it in the way that, say, Liverpool and Bristol were. But they did have connections in terms of kind of supporting the trade, the fruits of that labor. In other words, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, or providing, for example, the Pennants in North Wales who exploited slave labor in the Caribbean as well. And it just, and also the thing that struck me that was interesting, I had no idea about, is that one contribution was providing goods like slave clothing, which the Welsh could provide quite cheaply. So I thought it was kind of an interesting look at how the Welsh were involved in a way, not to the extent, of course, that perhaps you would imagine, the big slave traders were. But there is that historical connection as well that, that Wales and the Welsh and we must be aware of.
Stuart, you've got a sort of linked story to that.
Yeah, another story touching on the Black Lives Matter debate from the London papers. The Sunday Times got a piece written by the Formula One champion Lewis Hamilton, and at first glance I was tempted to dismiss it as just another PR puff written by his media advisors. But if you read a bit deeper, it's actually a really thoughtful contribution to the Black Lives Matter debate and the life opportunities that are available or not available to many BME people. And Lewis Hamilton has chosen to leverage his influence in motorsports and is setting up a commission, the Hamilton Commission, to explore how motorsport can be used to get more young people from black backgrounds into jobs in science, technology, engineering and maths, the so-called STEM subjects. And it seems to me to be another example of how prominent BME figures are looking at the debate over Black Lives Matter and trying to move it way beyond the perception that some sections of the media have put forward, that Black Lives Matter means throwing statues into Bristol Dock or spraying graffiti onto Winston Churchill. Lewis Hamilton's talking about practical and focused steps, trying to find tangible solutions to these problems. And we saw earlier this week Marcus Rashford, the footballer, using his influence to very skillfully bring about some change in government policy. And Lewis Hamilton's intervention now in his field of influence could become another example.